Welcome to Roses All Trash, the accompanying podcast to Read Community, an international reading club of essential justice texts. I'm Ryan, and I founded this club with my friend Catherine, and we also founded this podcast as a way for us to read along with you. We're on week 3 of our December 2020 calendar. What do we look like? First up is Anna Elias. I apologize if that's not the pronunciation of her name. I could not find a pronunciation for her name online. She wrote the essay Aesthetic Labor, in which she appropriately provides a definition of aesthetic labor. Quote, "There is an increasing tendency for organizations to manage the way their employees feel and look as well as the way they behave, so that work is emotional and aesthetic as well as, or instead of, productive." One of the classic examples of where aesthetic labor is required is of flight attendants. And in fact, there's some really good writing out there about how flight attendants unionized and how their organizing strategies are a great model for industries everywhere. So Elias specifies that aesthetic labor applies not only to appearance but also to voice, posture, demeanor, body language, self-presentation on social media, and so on. This is super interesting because for a long time in history, and even now, women's voices and their temperaments have been deemed wrong for many different professions. One of which is, oh, she's too emotional to be president. One perspective that used to be really prevalent is that women just don't have the right voice to read the news. And look where we are now. Next reading is by Sarah Banet-Weiser, I'm Beautiful the Way I Am. She talks about how corporations have made women's empowerment compatible to neoliberal capitalism. Quote, "For girls and young women, the confidence issue is located squarely on the body and in one's self-image." End quote. That's as opposed to an emphasis on joining together and unionizing the workplace, or organizing neighborhood and community resources, or creating political interest groups. Although women and their effort have been largely responsible for efforts like that in the past decade. Quote, "There is an absence of collectivity in these ads, and there is no gesture toward empowerment through solidarity. Rather, girls and women individually need to lean in, be confident, stop thinking I can't. This relieves institutions of the burden of having to grapple with restructuring their own gendered asymmetries." Next, we have Adrienne Evans, The Entrepreneurial Practices of Becoming a Doll. Evans writes about how there are conditions to reclaiming modern femininity. Quote, "Entrepreneurialism is central to the self-reliant, flexible, and choiceful performances of femininity that are privileged within post-feminism." Basically, she's talking about how it's really a privilege to be able to do girly things and participate in feminine activities. Part of the reason why it's a privileged activity is because obviously you need the money and the time to participate, but it's also privileged because ultimately these activities of femininity are advertised to us. And any good that's sold to us can't have 100% participation. Otherwise, the manufactured attraction of it goes away. Evans says that hyperfemininity is, quote, "not about submissiveness, fame, or snagging a husband. It could be about finding a way out, however random, bizarre, and costly," end quote. But ultimately, quote, "these new forms of aesthetic labor become inauthentic and uncanny, and are thus still often denied full participation and rendered near unintelligible." She's basically calling bullshit. Last up, we have a little bit of a pivot from Sianne Ngai, her interview with Cabinet Magazine on her book, Our Aesthetic Categories. In this interview and in her book, she discusses the word interesting and what that word really even says about us. Quote, "The interesting isn't an exclusively aesthetic category. In fact, it's a term critics often deliberately use to toggle between the aesthetic and extra aesthetic judgments." End quote. Extra aesthetic most likely meaning moral or not really purely artistic. Ngai also passes judgment on when people pass judgment. Quote, "I do think the compulsion to literally speak, the compulsion to make one's pleasure public, is fundamental to aesthetic judgment and therefore, one might argue, to aesthetic experience." End quote. In this interview, Ngai seems really convinced that we group beautiful things into 2 categories. The sublime, which are, ultimate and undeniable and respectable, and things that are cute or interesting, where we have a little bit of a diminutive attitude toward it. And in commenting on the latter, that's where we indulge our need to assert what we think, to pass judgment. Quote, "That's the claim for universality, without which a judgment would not be a judgment of taste." Honestly, Sianne Ngai's writings fully execute me. This This interview literally shook me at every single turn, and I could barely get through the introduction of the book that she's even talking about in it, so do not be shocked if her writings appear and reappear in future calendars. But for the purposes of our discussion, we gotta back it up to those girl power commercials. We all know what they are, we've seen them, they're virtue signaling, but you know, they always make us feel something anyway, because that's what they're supposed to do. So let's talk about that.
Alright. The most famous one, Dove bar soap. I think one that was most interesting to me is women describe themselves to police sketch artists and describe their faces, and then they had a stranger who had a photo of them or was looking at them, describe their face to the sketch artist, and they compared the two drawings, and it was the one the woman described herself, she'd be really small beady eyes set close together, thin lips, this really drawn face, kind of limp hair. And then, it would look like this very sort of aggressive, mean portrait. It would look like this very mean, ugly version of themselves. And then, the one that the stranger did would look like them.
I mean, obviously we know that, yes, these are for commercial purposes. Ultimately, you're supposed to feel good and then feel oh, this brand is doing a good job. They're a good person, which is twisted because it's not a person. It's a whole marketing team who decided, I think this will sit well with people, with our consumers and our buyers.
Yeah.
But I think people know that already. People already know, oh, ultimately they're trying to trick you. It might be for a good cause, and then people have opinions on that. But the readings for this week really showed me that, it's worse than that, because these companies are effectively gaslighting women into thinking that they're responsible for the beauty standards placed upon them. They're responsible for resisting them. They're responsible for their own confidence. It kind of reminded me of how, sometimes, just between people, women of color are told to love themselves or to love their bodies. But, the problem is not with them. I wasn't born with no self-confidence. It's just, the standards placed upon some people are, just racist or, they're just wrong,
There's a tweet that I saw that was it's not difficult to be black, it's difficult to deal with white people. Or it's not difficult to be a woman, it's difficult to deal with misogyny.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in general, women and people of color will know, yes, it's not my fault, but I guess I do have to figure out my response to it. And it feels so unfair, and it would be enough to accumulate in a kind of downward spiral at some point. Our lack of confidence is not our fault, and yet it's still, our problem. So I saw this, TikTok, this girl, her take, which I very much agreed with, is that, no, we don't exactly do makeup for ourselves. No, we don't exactly, dress nice for ourselves, but that's fine, because we're in such a pool of beauty standards that affect us even when we're alone. Yeah, this idea of just saying that I do makeup for myself doesn't really get at the problem. If I really had zero problems with the way I looked, I can't even imagine, what that would be like. To be in a world that just has never even heard of makeup, has never even heard of, checking yourself in the mirror,
I believe that, it's possible to do makeup mostly for yourself, but I think there is still, at some root, it is inherently positive, because it's about aesthetic, and it's about the way you present yourself to the world. It's hard to figure where things certain types of makeup play into that. I love doing eyeliner, and, I've had many men tell me that, they think it looks ugly or something, but, I still keep doing it. The reason I began in makeup was because I felt like I needed to change my face, and I can't speak the reason everyone else began using makeup as a child, but, that's sort of the switch. Well, what has grown from that is very different now.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that there are people who just are, wellsprings of creativity, and one day they looked in the mirror and they're like, what if I did this with my look or whatever? But what I can remember of, consciously wanting to put on makeup or even dress a certain way was, I want to look like something that I've seen before. And maybe I couldn't identify exactly who or what it was, but it was probably just somebody on TV, or probably what came to my head when I, read YA books and stuff like that, Doing the readings for this week and the past week made me realized for myself that femininity is more of a practice as opposed to an ideal image. At least for people our age, I think, because just as it's kind of useless to say, no, I do makeup for myself, or like, you think guys want blue eyeshadow, or you think guys want euphoria makeup? Of course I do it for myself, you know? It doesn't really matter what image you're aspiring to, because femininity, like, as an idealized image, doesn't really exist. Like, there are different beauty standards in different societies, different countries, different, just like, microcultures, even. And so, when we're talking about femininity as, like, a human concept, it's not so helpful to be like, well, I'm an alt version, or like, I'm a feminist, so this is like feminist makeup or something. It is very useful when we're talking about like individuals gaining their confidence and developing as people, I guess, aesthetic beings. But I think doing femininity, feeling femininity is ultimately more relatable of a thing to discuss.
I think the idea of femininity isn't about specific appearance at the end. Like you said, it's about like the fact that you put effort into your appearance. In like the patriarchal world that we've constructed, men don't put effort into their appearance the same way, or like they're not supposed to the same way women are. And I think this also like goes down to clothing as well. If you think about the simplicity of men's suits and the idea of the men's suit springing from this concept of practicality above all else and like, you know, function over form, and the suit sort of being derived from military uniform that just allows for ease of movement for the wearer to best achieve his goals, whereas women's clothing hasn't fully followed like that, or like women don't really have an equivalent of a suit in the same way that men do.
I didn't know that. I feel like that is a really relevant thing to bring up. Like,
no, yeah, the men's suit, I mean, a lot of different things contributed to the construction of the three-piece suit. Like a lot of neoclassical architecture and sort of the way the ideal male body was redefined by the rediscovery of neoclassical sculptures. But a lot of it was derived from when Britain first began to develop a standing army, because they needed uniforms to outfit all these soldiers for the first time. And this standard uniform, which sort of denoted rank but also symbolized the idea of being able to move upwards in rank through merit, was totally new. It's like so the military uniform began to sort of symbolize democracy, although it didn't necessarily enact it. And as a side note, the creation of the standardized uniform is why men's clothes often fit better, because they had to take thousands of measurements of all these soldiers to create a really well-fitting guide and standard of measurement for male clothes, but they didn't really do that for women. But yeah, the suit was really influenced by the sort of austere simplicity of the military uniform.
that actually convinces me more that any aesthetic practice or any sort of aestheticizing of ourselves is inherently feminine, because a lot of like reclaimed women's fashion is sort of like in spite of it being hard, like getting or putting on fake eyelashes in spite of it being bad for you, in spite of it taking time and being hard and something you have to learn how to do. Or high heels, because it makes you feel like hot and tall and powerful, in spite of the fact that it actually
damages your tendons.
Yeah, damages your tendons, pretty much incapacitates you to do everything you would normally be able to do. Of course, there are people who can run in heels, but
that takes time and practice.
Yeah, and it's not what they're meant for,
yeah.
Even though apparently it's supposed to make you more powerful or whatever. Yeah, a lot of like reclaiming, and this is a little less relevant because like slurs by nature are created by oppressors, not the oppressed. So, of course, reclaiming it has to be turning a negative into a positive. But there's no reason for women to do the same thing with their clothing as you would to a slur. What if, like, you know, a lot of women's liberation in the past has been like wearing things that are comfortable and wearing things that are functional. But now people are more like, no, I wear heels because it makes me feel good. And so there's this completely opposite relationship to clothing and relationship to confidence than like men's clothing with its functional root. Like that relationship for men, you know?
I was about to ask you what you thought of the idea of like vintage aesthetics, not vintage values, in terms of like, but you sort of revival of like usually 1940s, 1950s vintage aesthetics.
Is this like corset stuff? Like,
Yeah,
people
kind
are like,
of.
no, the corset makes me feel good.
I mean, okay, to be fair, the corset can be great back support. I don't think it's going to fix any health problems, but it was not actually that damaging.
Ultimately, to wear a corset like shape is because of that. Like, first of all, trying to fit it to a specific culture lane that feels like more home to you than the current culture, which is really interesting. And then secondly, to look a certain way.
I mean, corsets can be comfortable. So. It's an issue that sort of has affected what, like, feminine aesthetics in many, many ways is the industrialization of clothing has really changed the way we relate to clothes and thus to our appearance and the way we present ourselves.
That definitely fits into what you were talking about with how like men's suits are like well fitted because there's been more care and attention. Men's suits are expensive and there are tiny little seamstresses, tailors in Italy that are like 89 years old and they're still getting business because an industry can exist while the goods are expensive. But for women, it's supposed to be, for women's fashion or for female fashion, it's like, no, we have to do this fast fashion thing. We have to do, in order to prop up these industries, which are actually companies that are just unable to balance their books because they should not exist. Because they're relying on extremely cheap labor and on replacing women's wardrobes every single season, twice a year, 3 times a year, you know. If you really think about it, like, there's a huge corporate pressure put on just women consumers to replace their items because it's like that speech from Devil Wears Prada, where she's like, we made up the trend. Like, we made up this color that people are going to start to like. You know, it's not high taste by any means.
Yeah.
You know?
That's like, I've been reading this book recently. I just got it the other day and started reading it, Living Modern. It's about Georgia O'Keeffe and it's about her wardrobe. I have some bones to pick about Georgia O'Keeffe in some areas, but she had this super simple wardrobe. She was famous for her, like, wrap dresses. She also had these black suits. She had these white shirts. She found the thing she liked and she stuck with it, regardless of trends. And there's something I think really admirable about that, but that's discouraged because that doesn't make a good consumer.
Right, and I think, I wonder if, like, women are, by social conditioning, inherently unable to pick a uniform because so much of our like feminine role is to be adaptable to situations, to be as helpful as possible to anyone at any time, and like that encourages also like shifting between culture lanes, looking like I remember I would like look at these like books and stuff, like these comic books or whatever when I was younger, where it was like what to wear to meet your boyfriend's parents, what to wear to meet your boyfriend's friends, what to wear on a date, like what shade of lipstick should you wear to a job interview. Like it's all different, you know.
And that's because women's style changes. I mean, there are different theories and criticisms about whether or not men's fashion is actually slower in its trends than women's. And I do think men's fashion has a lot of depth and variation that isn't necessarily as observable, but it's still there. But women's fashion, because the trends change so quickly, it's really hard if a woman finds something that she feels great in, she thinks she looks great in, is like, you know, looks good. If she sticks with it for more than a year or two, people will be like, oh, that's so old, that's so weird, like that rise of jeans is no longer in.
Yeah, and think about it, like, think about how much money brands make now with a basics line, or like, oh, new classic, or whatever. Like, that's a whole another wave that I think we should change the way we talk about trends. Instead of saying trends change a lot, it should be that trends are changed, trends are manipulated. Like, it all comes from the top, you know?
Yeah.
There is so much manipulated about our idea of masculinity and femininity and everything in between. We barely touched on it just through the lens of clothing and industrialization of clothing. There is so much more material out there, so many more avenues of analysis that really make you think about, like, how much are you told what to be before you are that? Like, not to be paranoid, but how much training do I go through to feel like a woman, to be a woman? And if I had been born male, then to feel like a man. Reading into this subject area just a little bit made me already feel like we're all just orbiting this invisible planet of femininity, of masculinity, of performance. It makes me think, did it have to be about gender, or could it have been about something else? Or is gender actually so close to, you know, our bodies and our hearts that only exploiting a sense like that, an instinct like that, would have such power over us and what we do and what we think and who we think we want to be and what we dream? And, you know, I think a lot of people my age just want to know who they are or what they're supposed to be doing, and this definitely isn't the first or last time I will ever feel this, but I don't think there's anything wrong with, you know, sitting in a feeling a little bit. I think that we should welcome a little bit of gender discomfort that maybe has nothing to do with gender dysphoria. Not being uncomfortable in our body maybe, but just in our mind. It's not bad to have touch points and references for beauty, for, you know, femininity, masculinity, however you want to look and feel. But remember that you weren't born thinking about what you looked like. There's a pretty significant time period of your life where you probably didn't have any idea. Like, on a physiological level, your brain couldn't have imagined yourself in front of you or recalled the memory of yourself in a mirror. And also where you didn't care, like where your world was like consumed by how you felt on the inside and what you saw and felt on the outside. I'm not saying that that's how we should live all the time, but what an incredible experiment to simplify your world. Every man-made invention exists right now because somebody thought about it, including your clothing, your makeup, your jewelry. Everything you want to be came from someone else's brain. So that said, please follow us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts. Please rate and review on Apple Podcasts. Oh, and follow our Instagram, Roses All Trash, and follow my personal Instagram, RRRYEN, and Catherine's personal Instagram, Catherine.shark. We love you, we respect you, and we're rooting for